Democracy. Both the best and worst political system, depending on whether your team wins or loses. The system that protects you from a mad dictator, but also lets you elect them because why the hell not? The system where nothing gets done because everyone is too busy arguing, which can be both a good thing and a bad thing. The system which you love because it gives you a voice, but you also hate it because the barely literate guy sitting next to you also has a voice. Anyway, let's talk about democracy in Middle-earth. What was it, who had it, and why wasn't there that much of it? If you're familiar with Middle-earth, you might notice something. Almost everyone is ruled by a king, and in some rare cases a queen. At the end of the Third Age, we have Rohan, the Elves of Mirkwood, the Dwarves of Erebor, Dale. Even those that aren't ruled by a king are still ruled by the equivalent of a king. In Gondor, Denethor has pretty much all the powers of a king, same with Celeborn and Galadriel in Lothlorien. Basically, almost every nation is a monarchy of some sort, and kings and lords are usually well-meaning, highly respected figures from legendary lineages. Of course, this isn't too odd for a fantasy setting, but when it comes to Middle-earth there is a reason. Tolkien's political beliefs were rather strange, to put it lightly. Despite what some people would have you believe, his ideology doesn't really fit into any modern ideologies or really any ideology of his own time. He kind of just had a mishmash of different beliefs across the entire political spectrum. He referred to himself as an anarchist at one point, stating a distrust in the government and the state beyond what was necessary. He also expressed a belief in an enlightened monarchism of sorts, an unconstitutional monarchy that was headed by a philosopher king who didn't use real power and only intervened when necessary. And then there's democracy. I don't think it's fair to say that Tolkien hated democracy, he just didn't have a lot of nice things to say about it. He did refer to it once as mob rule in a letter to his son Christopher, and later declared, "Not that I am a Democrat in any of its current uses." Current uses is the key phrase here. In 1956, Tolkien writes this: "I am not a Democrat only because humility and equality are spiritual principles corrupted by the attempt to mechanize and formalize them." So, while he's not against the concept of democracy, he is skeptical of it and believes it would be corrupted by a giant state apparatus. Okay, so we can sort of see why there wasn't really much democracy in Middle-earth, but there was some. I can think of 4 examples in total, I may have missed some. These examples are all different, and I'm not sure we can call some of them true democracies. Firstly, we have democracy being used to elect an actual ruler, and that example is in Lake Town, Esgaroth. The title was Master of Lake Town, but apart from that, we actually know very little about it. The Master is said to have been elected from amongst the old and wise, which might mean that there was some sort of prerequisite such as age or something more subjective such as education or respect or prestige. The Master also seems to have been in command of the Esgaroth Town Guard. Unfortunately, the Master of Lake Town, his name unknown, that appears in The Hobbit has a less than stellar representation. He's a greedy opportunist who immediately tries to save his own skin at the sign of any trouble. That said, he's not incompetent, he's charismatic, and when the surviving townsfolk blame him for bringing Smaug upon them, he successfully shifts the blame to the dwarves. He also directs the reconstruction of Lake Town, and later, when the gold from Erebor is split, he rewards his friends and followers, perhaps showing that he maintained his power by having loyal benefactors. However, he has a grim end. Apparently overwhelmed by dragon sickness, he steals much of the gold and flees into the wastes, where he is eventually deserted by his companions and then starves. But while the Master of Lake Town was corrupt and ultimately self-serving, I don't think this should be taken as a rejection of democracy, and instead, a warning as to how democracy can be exploited. We know this because the new Master has the people's best interests at heart, and is described as being wise, extremely popular, and directly responsible for much of the prosperity that Esgaroth then experienced, after being rebuilt. Basically, the old Master sought power for selfish reasons, and had the charisma and connections to keep that power, whereas the new Master, while we don't know much about him, the fact that he's described as wise seems to indicate that he hasn't necessarily taken the job because he wants to, but perhaps because he believes he needs to. The second form of democracy we encounter is in the Shire. Following the end of Arnor, the Shire became independent, and at the end of the Third Age, it still didn't really have a true government of sorts. That said, the 3 most influential positions in the Shire were the Thane, the Master of Buckland, and the Mayor of Mickle Delving. While the first 2 were hereditary, held by the heads of the Tooks and the Brandybucks, the Mayor was an elected position. That said, while the Mayor of Delving was commonly referred to as the Mayor of the Shire, the position had very little power. They did not govern the Shire or make any laws, and instead would do things like preside over banquets or make appearances at important events. The only responsibilities the mayor truly had was that they were also the postmaster and the first sheriff. Basically, head of the postal service and law enforcement. That said, these titles also seem to have come without any real power. When Sharky's ruffians invaded the Shire, the mayor at the time, Will Whitfoot, was unable to resist them in any meaningful way beyond personally protesting, which ended with him being thrown into jail. So basically, while there was a democracy in place in the Shire, it would be ridiculous to argue that the Shire had a democratic government, because realistically, it didn't have a government. The Mayor of Delving was pretty much just an honorific, a title given to a respectable hobbit who had some minor responsibilities but no real power. And while this worked fine for the most part, thanks to hobbits being independent yet rigid followers of rules and traditions, it proved to be completely useless when the Shire faced an actual threat. The third democracy, or rather democratic system that we encounter, is in Fangorn Forest. Yes, it's the Ents. Now, the Ents absolutely do not have any form of government. The closest thing they have is elders. Treebeard, also known as Fangorn, is one of the oldest, and his word and name carries respect. We're also told that one of the other elder Ents, Skinbark, or Fladriff, had people of his own, which reveals that individual Ents or Huorns did sometimes choose someone to follow. What we end up witnessing is the Entmoot, a convening of the Ents in a dell known as Durndingle, which is a fantastic name. This event wasn't mandatory, as Treebeard had to convince several people to come. It also doesn't seem to have been exclusive, as there are both older Ents and younger Ents there. How exactly the discussion worked is unknown, but it did take a long time. When it came to the discussion about attacking Isengard, it took over 2 whole days before the Ents came to a decision. In the end, they voted in favour of attacking Isengard and proceeded to make short work of Saruman's fortress. Our final example is a democratic system existing within a monarchy. I am referring to the House of Halef, who dwelt in Brethil during the First Age. Now, the House of Halef was ruled by a chief, and this was a hereditary position, going from father to son, or to another close member of the family if there was no son available. However, the Lords of Brethil did not have absolute power. We see this in the Wanderings of Hurin, a deleted chapter of the Silmarillion. Hurin is accused of assaulting Hardang, the Lord of Brethil, but Hardang cannot punish Hurin without consulting something called the Folkmoot. The Folkmoot was a large gathering of at least 500 headsmen, basically the leaders of families across Brethil, and their role was to democratically decide on whatever motions it were being put forth for judgment. Unfortunately, we only witness one, and it is an utter disaster. Hardang is corrupt, Hurin incites a riot, and then a fight breaks out and multiple people die, including Hardang. Even if unjust and authoritarian, it would have worked out better for Brethil and the rest of Beleriand if Hardang had simply executed Hurin when he had the chance. Well, these are really the only 4 democracies that exist in Middle-earth, and I use the word democracy very lightly. There are some other examples of people power coming into play. We witnessed 2 of these firsthand. After Bard slays Smaug, the people of Laketown voice overwhelming support in making him king. We see the same with Aragorn when he returns to Minas Tirith after Sauron is defeated. Faramir asks the people of Gondor assembled for their approval, and they overwhelmingly voice their support of making Aragorn king. The support of population being used to elect kings probably happened in other circumstances too. Finwë, Elwë, and Ingwë being made kings of their respective elven folk before the journey to Valinor, and Elendil being made kings of the Númenóreans in exile after the downfall of Númenor. We also see something like this during the rebellion of the Noldor. While Fëanor and his followers were always planning on chasing Morgoth to Middle-earth, many others only did so because the majority of the Noldor favoured it. With the 4 examples I mentioned before, you can see the flaws in democracy in Middle-earth fairly easily. The Master of Laketown was corrupt, the Folkmoot at Brethil directly led to violence, the Entmoot was extremely slow, and the Mayor of the Shire didn't actually do anything. But the only reason why these systems are worse than the monarchical systems in Middle-earth is because the kings in Tolkien's universe are unrealistically good. There's only a handful of truly terrible kings, whether they be tyrannical or incompetent. Most kings are brave, just, wise, or neutral at worst. Of course, this isn't really true in our own world, and it's why Middle-earth is called fantasy. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I started writing this script like a week before the 2024 US election, so yeah, it's a year old. My intro actually made a joke about the important upcoming election, and in a plot twist that absolutely no one would have seen coming, it was the federal election of Palau, which is an island in the Pacific. In case you're wondering, this was won by Sarangel Whips Jr., who was actually born in the US and studied there. I'm not sure what his policies are, and honestly, it probably doesn't really matter, but from what I can tell, he hasn't threatened to invade Venezuela yet, so I think that's a plus. Anyways, cheers, farewell, and remember, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government.